Welcome back to the Down South Hunting Weather-Based Deer Movement Study. This is Mike Higman, and this episode is presented by Onyx Hunt app. We really appreciate them partnering with us. Make sure you go check out the app and download your free trial if you haven't tried it out yet. This is part 2 of a 3-part series. Yes, you heard me right. We're doing 3 parts now. I had too much content. We couldn't fit it all in these 2 parts, so we're going to have another episode next week finishing this series out. If you have not listened to episode 1 or part 1 of the series yet, make sure you go back to last week's and listen to that first. It'll really put this all in context for you. I'm really excited about what we've got in today's episode. We're going to start out with Dr. Duane Diefenbach, and next we're going to have the mad scientist of deer, Mark Drury. And finally, we're going to finish things out with Lindsay Thomas Jr. of the QDMA. Really 3 great interviews that I'm really excited for you guys to listen to. And then next week for part 3, I'm going to be talking to everybody we talked to back in part 1. We're going to talk to Spencer Newharth. We're going to talk to Adam Cruz. We're going to talk to Will Brantley and Jeff Genke. We're going to get everybody's thoughts and feelings and everything back out on the table and see if anybody changes their mind, how they feel about things. A couple things quickly before we jump into the interviews. If you have not subscribed yet, you may be missing out. Adam Cruz was kind enough to point out to some mess-ups that I left in the last episode. And if you were subscribed and downloaded that right away, you got to hear me sounding like an idiot. And if you were not subscribed and downloaded those late, I took those out. So if you like hearing me say stupid things and mess up, then make sure you're subscribed because there's a real good chance that I'm going to be doing that again. Make sure you're checking out huntinggeardeals.com every single day. That is Hunting Gear Deals. If you're in the market for some hunting boots, trail cameras, tree stands, whatever it is you're in the market for, a lot of times we have coupon codes for entire sites like eBay. Amazon's got a lot of great deals all the time. Trail camera batteries, stuff like that. Whatever you're in the market for, make sure you're checking out our site first and get the best deal on that stuff. The only other thing is I would ask if this is something you enjoy, you want us to do some more of, please just give us some feedback. Reach out to us on social media. Share this with your friends. And just leave us a late rating or review wherever you listen to this, wherever you want to do it. We really appreciate it. All right, let's go ahead and jump into these interviews. Okay, next we're going to talk to Dr. Duane Diefenbach, and he works at Penn State University. I had the pleasure of meeting him at the QDMA convention in Louisiana last year, and we actually recorded a podcast with him. I think it was maybe number 11, and a very popular podcast as well. So if you want to go back and take a listen to it, we talked about a lot of the studies that he's done GPS tracking deer. And Dr. Diefenbach has a bunch of really cool titles that I am not going to be able to spout off the top of my head. I know he's an adjunct professor and he's in charge of the Deer Force Study program. So maybe you can help me out, Duane, and just share with me what you do and what the Deer Force Study is.
Sure. Well, I actually work for the U.S. Geological Survey. I'm the leader of the Pennsylvania Cooperative Fish and Wildlife Research Unit, and that's a joint venture of the Pennsylvania Game Commission, U.S. Geological Survey, and Penn State University. And so my job really is to do research, especially in collaboration with the Pennsylvania Game Commission. And I've been doing white-tailed deer work with them for the past almost 18 years now.
We covered some of this in the first episode, but can you kind of remind us basically how your GPS study program works as far as capturing the deer and how many there are and what kind of data you're getting?
Sure. So this is part of a larger project looking at how deer vegetation and soils interact to influence the plant communities that we see in our forests. And so part of that we are monitoring deer populations. And so we capture deer in the winter, usually starting in mid-January and depending on how the winter goes into early April or late March. A lot of those deer, we have 40 collars, so we try and maintain at the end of that trapping period to have 40 deer on air. These are GPS satellite collars. So you can think of them as a handheld GPS unit that hangs around the deer's neck but it also communicates with a satellite. So we can give it commands to start collecting data at different times, or and it also sends us the data back.
And how many, or where are these deer being tracked? It's
right.
Forest for the most part, right?
Yeah, they're all large tracts of state forest land. 2 of our study areas are in central Pennsylvania in the Ridge and Valley region. They're long, linear forested ridges. Each of our study areas is anywhere from 25 to 40 square miles. And then we also have 2 study areas up in north central Pennsylvania. It's called the Big Woods area because it's probably over 1 million acres of over 95% forested land.
So as we talked about, I'm interested in finding information about deer movement related to weather and specifically temperature. And I was wondering is that something that you guys have looked at all as far as how deer move distance or time in relation to weather?
We have looked at some aspects of that. We have focused on the month of October because in Pennsylvania, that's when the archery season opens up. And our archery season opens the first Saturday closest to October 1, and it runs through the middle of November. So, of course, in Pennsylvania, by the last week of October, the rut really starts to kick in. So by the end of October, maybe 20% of our females have been bred. And by the 13th of November, half of them are bred. So when we've looked at weather and factors that influence deer movements, it's always been from like the last week in September through the 3rd week in October. Because once you get into the rut, I really don't think there's anything that bothers male deer except a female deer. So we've been focusing in that archery period before the rut kicks in.
Okay, and is there anything definitive you've been able to find out? Or I guess in science, I guess nobody wants to say anything's definitive, but maybe relatively definitive as far as any different weather patterns that might affect the movement?
Yeah, so we focused on wind and rain. There's a lot of other things that we want to look at, like when fronts come through and if deer react to fronts, whether cold or warm fronts. But we've just focused on so far wind speed, and rain. And actually, I've had a couple of undergrad students do these as independent projects. And a couple of years ago, a few years, well, probably more than a couple now, a couple of students looked at wind and rain. And then just this past summer, I had another undergraduate who basically repeated their study to see if she saw the same patterns as before. And so it was pretty interesting. The first study, so we took the data in late September through into late October. It was really interesting is that there was really not much effective wind, but also we didn't have much wind. October in Pennsylvania is a beautiful time of year. It's usually fairly decent temperatures. It might dip down into the 40s, maybe as cold as the 30s at night, but during the day it could be in the 60s up into the 80s. And it's just very pleasant weather. We don't get a lot of storms. I mean, we might get some rain events, but it's pretty placid. And so during that month that they looked at the data, it was basically calm winds, calm and gentle breezes for that whole time period. And so they didn't find much effect on wind. However, she did find some interesting things with rain in that rain, whether it was raining or not, had no effect on female deer. They moved just as much, just as far, whether it was raining or not. But male deer actually reduced their movements with during the rain days that were rainy. And I can't explain why that is, other than maybe that's more evidence that men are wimps. I don't know. When it comes down to it. So anyway, that was our initial findings in that project. And then another undergrad, Jessica, came last summer and took another year's worth of data and basically repeated that analysis. And she actually found an interaction between the two, in that rain and wind didn't have a whole lot of effect on females. But if you looked at males, when it was very windy and rainy, they actually moved more. And so there is some effect on weather. It's not a huge effect. And basically, Jessica's conclusion is that you basically have no excuse for not hunting in rainy or windy weather, because the deer appear to basically move the same amount.
Okay. And I know there's a whole long blog post about this. Would be a good chance to talk about your blog, because there's a ton of really good information on these GPS studies. This podcast is focused on the South a lot. Hopefully this particular episode will be interesting to hunters across the country. But also, I know your blog is interesting to hunters across the country, because it's a lot of, scientifically backed GPS studies that really, it's not the sole purpose of it, but addresses a lot of issues that hunters have and questions about deer movement. So maybe just tell us what it is and where we can find it.
Sure. So the blog is at ecosystems.psu.edu/deer. And we started that blog with the deer forest study because I wanted to share results with the general public and hunters especially, as we were doing this work. This is going to be a long-term study. We've already done 5 years worth of work, and we're looking at another 5 years. Because, as I mentioned before, the deer forest study is not as much about deer as it is about deer and vegetation and soils and how they influence our forests. And of course, vegetation just doesn't change that fast. So it has to be a long-term study. So anyway, that was the motivation for doing the blog. And also because we had these satellite GPS collars, it was just an opportunity to answer some interesting questions and address some conventional wisdoms about what we think deer do in response to this and that, and actually put those, conventional wisdoms to the test with some data. And it's been a lot of fun. And it's not just our GPS data, my work with the Game Commission, we've, studied lots of different things, harvest rates and dispersal movements and a whole host of things. So whenever we get interesting results to share with folks, we try to put that into a short, easily readable format.
Yeah, you guys do a great job of that. And I think if you can't remember that URL, I think if you just Google deer forest study, it'll come right up.
Oh, yeah, definitely.
So I'm curious, I know you're personally a hunter. Have you been able to take away anything as far as when to hunt based on these GPS tracking studies? Do you either, versus weather or time of year or anything like that?
Nope. That's the short answer.
Yeah. Whenever you have time, I guess.
Yeah, right. Exactly. Yeah, there's, there's different. So we have learned a lot. I shouldn't say that. I mean, relative to weather, like I said, we've always focused on that October because the rut deer are just crazy. And I don't think weather plays any role in their movements during that time of year. And then our main hunting season is the rifle season, which starts the Monday after Thanksgiving and goes for 2 weeks. And there are so many people in the woods at that time of year that basically it's actual hunter activity that influences what deer do, and not so much weather or moon or anything like that. So that's been the focus, is because we figured that if weather was going to if there were any insights to be gained from weather, they'd be most valuable in that archery season before the rut starts.
Okay. And I guess I had one last question regarding the study I think you said Jessica did most recently. And she was able to find some type of correlation with bucks, but not does. How many different bucks are you looking at, and how often are those data points taken on your GPS collars?
It varies. So that time of year, the bucks were getting a location every 3 hours. And then we were doing, on the females, we actually had data every hour, because we were doing a fawn survival study, and we had females and their fawns radio collared. So we wanted to, get more detailed movements on the females. So that was the timing for it. Differed a little bit by males and females. I know. So there's one other thing. I know it's not technically weather, but Jessica also looked at the moon and how moonlight might influence deer movements during that archery season. And this was kind of a personal interest to her, because her grandfather always told her that, when it's a full moon out, the deer are active all night, and then they're not active during the day. So, hunting isn't as good. And so she wanted to see actually what effect, those moonlit nights had on deer movements. And so she split nights into basically what we call let's say new moon, which would be illumination of the moon would be like less than 30%, right? So either no moon at all or just a crescent moon. And then she looked at either a waxing or waning moon, where most of the moon, or about half the moon, was illuminated, give or take a little bit. And then she looked at, nearly full moon periods. So she broke up moonlit nights into 3 different classes of brightness. And she wanted to see if movements over the course of a day differed depending on moon phase. And she actually was able to show a statistically difference in movements, in that on moonlit nights, deer tended to walk a little bit further, and during the day, they didn't move as much. But basically, her conclusion was that it wasn't more than like an extra trip to the bathroom for us. If it was a full moon night, they might walk like 4 meters less per hour on average during the day. And her conclusion was that, yes, I found a statistical effect, because we had so many deer collared in thousands and thousands of locations, but from a, biological importance, she concluded that there really was no difference there either.
That's pretty interesting, actually, because, I've heard a lot of scientific studies that say there's absolutely no difference. So, this almost falls kind of in between, where, there's some hunters that think, they might only move an extra, 20 yards or something like that. But that might be the difference. If you're set up 100 yards away, that 20 yards might be the difference of, whether you see them or they're in range or that kind of thing. So, I think that's pretty interesting. I guess, are those data points you're looking at, are those, still taken every 1 or 3 hours? So are you basically just judging the total distance they've traveled, not so much exactly where they traveled, because it's, the time frames are set apart?
Yeah, well, actually, I should, put a caveat on there, is that she only did that analysis with the females because we had a location every hour.
Okay.
And we weren't able to address that question with our buck data because 3 hours is just too long time interval.
Right. Okay.
But so, yeah, that work that she did with females was just, she looked at the average distance they moved every hour of the day and plotted that over that time period during the archery season.
Thank you so much for coming on with me to discuss this, and I appreciate your perspective. You know, I've had some other guys from the South on, and I wanted to try to get somebody with maybe some different perspective on it. So I really appreciate you sharing me the information that you did have.
No problems. My pleasure.
All right, next up, we're going to have Mark Drury, the mad scientist. And I just wanted to mention a couple things before we jump into this interview. First of all, I want to apologize for a couple audio issues we had where the call dropped and that kind of stuff. Mark was in the middle of a turkey hunting camp out at his property where he had Cuz Strickland and some other hunters who were a lot more important than I am, and he found a way to squeeze this interview in. So I really appreciate him doing that, and we just kind of had to work with what we had at the time. The other thing I wanted to mention is when we did this interview, he had not released yet, but they've got a new app out called the Deercast app, and that app is designed specifically to predict deer movement based on weather patterns. And, Mark probably was working on this at the time, but I don't believe for a second that his decisions and the way he talks about this was at all influenced about him coming out with this app. First of all, the app is free, but really you hear the passion in his voice. You know this is what he believes and why he believes it. The other thing is, regardless of where you come out believing at the end of listening to all this, I really encourage everybody to go and download and get that app. First of all, there is the weather stuff, which I'm really excited about comparing deer movement with what the app says in the first place. And second of all, there's tons and tons of great hunting content, a lot of their videos and stuff and updates. And also there's even like a social media feature too, where you have the opportunity to, comment with a lot of people you're seeing on TV. So I think it's a really cool opportunity and a really cool app. So I just want to make sure I mentioned beforehand. Thanks for coming on with me. I'm really excited to have you. I know you got a camp full of turkey hunters right now, so I appreciate you making some time for me.
No, I'm happy to do it, man.
Okay, so like we talked about yesterday, I've been talking to some biologists and basically looking at a study or multiple studies that are saying that deer movement has nothing to do with the weather and is based strictly on, the only thing that's going to change their movement is basically rut activity. So it doesn't matter what the temperature is or the pressure or any of that stuff. And like we talked about, I know you haven't seen these studies, you haven't heard what these other guys have to say, but I do know you are the mad scientist when it comes to this stuff, and you are well known throughout the industry as for being able to pattern deer based on weather patterns. So basically, I just wanted to get a counterpoint to that. So I know you're not speaking specific to these guys or these studies, but I just wanted to get your side of the story as far as how you know that weather affects deer movement.
Well, it's 100% related to deer movement, or deer movement's 100% related to weather. They're slaves to their stomach, and it comes down to they move in an effort to go eat, go to bed, go to water, or to rut. That type of movement gets enhanced, particularly the feed type movement, when they need to eat to survive. If you look at worst case scenario, if you look at deer in the winter, say it's January, there's limited food source out there, and you have a major cold front with snow, you're going to see deer yard up and you're going to see them go to the last available food source. You could contrast that with the same date range and it be 50 degrees above normal. You're not going to see deer struggling to get to food. So I use that example because that happens day in and day out throughout the season, but that's where it's most evident. They are very much in tune with, or they move, in my opinion, much better when you have a departure from the normal temperature of that time frame. In other words, if the normal temperature for a high in September is 68 and all of a sudden you get daytime highs of 48, you're going to see it being an influencer of daylight activity. If, however, you are 20 degrees above the normal high for that time of the year, you're going to see it be a suppression of deer movement. It's very related to overall temperature as it relates to the normal high for that time of the year. That's one variable we look at, and it's one that goes throughout the entire season. If the normal high in December is 42 and you're going to be 20 that day, they're going to move better than if it was going to be 70 that day. It's really common sense, because it all gets back to the fact that they're slaves to their stomach. The colder it is, the more the fronts come in, the more that they have to go eat in order to live, to survive. Mm-hmm. There is much greater pressure on them to survive when the weather's bad and cold. So they move more. They're more active in colder weather. Other things that make them move a great deal is high pressure. They move more willingly, much more during pressure day than they do a low pressure day. Pressure is also relative to the season. The exception to that is when the pressure bottoms out on a fairly low reading and it coincides with a normal afternoon movement time. I have really, really good activity when that pressure bottoms out. It's kind of on the front end of the front before it gets there.
Can you kind of give me an idea how you analyze this stuff? I know it's something you've looked at for years, and how have you been able to kind of pinpoint some of these differences? Because I know it's more than, I know for you, it's not so much, just the temperature. You're looking at the pressure and the wind speed and the moon and so many different variables.
Absolutely. We just have kept notes through the years. We also compare those notes with each other, myself and my brother. And then we also look at daylight activity spiking within our trail camera pictures. You could just about bank on it. The same day that you see good activity because of a cold front coming through, you get a bunch of daylight pictures of mature bucks. And much of what we talk about, we're referencing mature bucks. And I don't know whether their studies were on mature bucks or all deer, or if they just radio collar a deer and then look at that one deer's movement, or whether they radio collar 20 or 30 deer in a herd and look at all the deer's movement, because, it definitely enhances how many deer you see during daylight activity based on all these different weather principles we live by. I'm riding down the road with Tad Brown, who's a big trapper, and he, when I lost you, he was talking about what an influencer it is on trapping and critters, and how any trapper worth its salt has all his traps ready before that front comes in, because everything's moving. And it's the same with deer. I mean, they sense that front coming in, and they sense the need to feed, and they're slaves to their stomach. They'll go out and feed. So, but getting back to the mature bucks, that there's very few days during the fall that they're going to move during daylight activity. When they actually do, many of them move on the exact same day, and that's generally because of a weather influencer. We look for barometric pressure that is above 30. We look for wind speeds that are somewhere between 8 and 15 mile an hour, probably 8 and 20. If you start to get extreme wind up above, say 35, 40 mile an hour, that's a suppressor. If you have very light winds, sometimes that can be a suppressor. We also look for precip. There are days when a rain front comes through, and the moment it passes, literally every deer in the herd will be on their feet. And it's noticeable. So I don't understand how. I would love to see the basis of their studies and see how they're not seeing these same things that we've been observing the last 30 years. I also, a major influencer is when you have a major cold front that sustains for 3, 4, 5 days, winds out of the north, cold, cold, cold. The first day that it warms up, first south after a bunch of north, major movement all day, particularly if it's accompanying high pressure. So there's a lot of different influencers, and they're not minor influences, they're majors. Some suppressors, generally really warm temperatures, suppress them the most, particularly if you're 15, 20 degrees above the normal range for that time of the year. Similar weather patterns day in and day out. In other words, weather that's not changing. Generally, the deer movement lessens day after day. It's a suppressor through the long term. Extended low pressure, cloud cover, it can be a suppressor, particularly in December, the late season. Cloudy days are much worse than sunny days. So I'm just kind of spitballing here some of the things that I see that are either an influence or a suppressor.
Right. So, I mean, I think what you just shared with me, I mean, probably listeners are going to need to replay that a few times to digest it, but I share your confusion, because it's not like I'm just talking to the one guy that feels this way. It's probably 98% of hunters that feel this way. So I want to throw at you a couple reasons that maybe these guys think that it is the overwhelming feeling of hunters. is one, the reason that it seems like you see them all on those perfect days is because those are the days that we are hunting, and those are the days that we expect to see the most movement. Is that something where I know you do this for a living, so you're not tied to only getting to go certain days on a weekend. Your job is to go out and kill deer. So are you out there on the days that are not as favorable as well, maybe just in different areas?
That's craziness, though. I mean, that's just ludicrous thinking. If it's opening day of rifle season, good weather, bad weather, guys are going to be out there. If it's a good cold front, they're going to see deer. If it's not, they're not. And in our case, we hunt every single day. We don't miss a day. So, the fact that we go 3 or 4 days in a row and see 1 or 2 deer, and then all of a sudden we see 30, what influenced that? It's the weather front or some weather influencer. So I can't even believe they would make that statement. Guys are going to hunt when they can hunt, and the movement is better when the weather's right.
Is this now, in the beginning of our conversation, you mentioned, end of season and survival and snow and that kind of stuff, but are you seeing the same type of results in bow season too, when it's a lot warmer?
Absolutely, man. It's a suppressor regardless. That's why I said it's the normal temperature range for that time of the year. In other words, the average high in September might be 60. The average high in December might be 40. Whether you're 20 degrees above normal in September or December, it's still going to be generally a suppression.
Yeah. And I'll tell you what, this whole conversation has me really torn, because I really like these GPS tracking studies and this, as in depth as they go to. And I think you might be interested to hear some of what they have to say once this comes out. But at the same time, I can't throw away the knowledge of seasoned guys like you. And, it seems so obvious, like you said. It seems like common sense. Yeah, when it's cooler, they're going to move more. They don't want to move when it's hot. So I don't even know what I feel like I'm going to have to listen this through a few times. I can't even form my own opinion at this point.
Yeah, it's just basic, honestly. I mean, I would love to take whatever biologist and for a 10-day study on my farm and show them, and I could about tell them when they're going to move and when they aren't going to based on the weather forecast. I could just about bet you on that. You catch a front coming through, they're going to move their butts off. I mean, you can watch the same field 10 nights in a row, and 2 or 3 nights you're going to see 40 or 50 deer, and the other nights you're going to see 1 or 2. And it's all because of the weather fronts.
Well, and I can't tell you how many times I've heard somebody say, oh, I took a trip to the Midwest. I'm from the South, so, a lot of times somebody will take a 1-week trip and let's say, yeah, movement was horrible the whole week. It was hot. And then the final 2 days, a cold front came through and we saw tons of deer, something along those lines, or, the weather affecting it.
Yeah, it ain't even a conversation. You know what I mean? Like I've never heard of this before. Weather's everything. I think there's 11 major influencers. We document them every day.
Yeah. Well, I know you guys did a whole different show on them, so.
Yeah, we do. We talk about them a great deal.
Well, I guess the show is on the different seasons. But I also know you guys focus on the different. Yeah, the 13 was on the seasons, but I know you guys focus on the weather influence quite a bit as well, along with those.
Well, yeah, just like heavy rain. You could sit there in the heaviest rain and you will not see a deer on their feet. I mean, not a single deer. And then all of a sudden it passes and that cold front hits right behind it and every deer in the herd will get on their feet. So based on their observation, there's no difference in the heavy rain that rained for 4 straight hours and the 30 minutes that follows it. And I can tell you the difference is extreme.
A lot of these
snow, heavy.
A lot of these studies, they're looking at maybe the distance of the movement. So maybe it's not that they're moving more, but they're moving earlier. Is that right? Or do you think maybe they're actually covering more ground as well? They might, if it's a buck, he's covering more of his area absolutely. When the weather's right.
Yeah, they'll cover more ground. Give me a high-pressure day with a northwest wind during the peak of the rut and watch how many bucks you see walking. I'm not talking a few yards. I'm talking hundreds of yards. Maybe their GPS collar just shows movement, across 50 yards, but he moved. He moved around his bed. He got up, he fed, he browsed around, blah, 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 blah. Well, maybe they're calling that movement versus one that walked a half mile because the weather was ideal, and they're calling both of those instances movement. Well, one of them, he didn't leave his bed area, and the other one, he moved and covered ground. I don't know how the studies went down, but that's
I think these are callers that are taking positions about every 15 minutes, and they're, I think, within 10 yards or something like that. So, of course, these are, I'm saying studies in general. Every study's got their own callers and their own people looking at the numbers and that kind of stuff. And it's not like there's thousands of them, but there's more than one that they're looking at. So they're looking at every 15 minutes, and it'll if the deer gets up and moves 10 yards, and they'll be able to tell he moved 10 yards more or less.
Gotcha. Yeah, I don't know.
Yeah, me neither yet. It didn't clear anything up, and I didn't think talking to you was, but I really hate to just look at one side of the equation and not consider the other, especially with something like this when there's like a prevailing knowledge of what deer do. And the reason I want to do this is it is what you said. It seems so contrary to what everybody thinks. So it's something I find really interesting.
And they think it for a reason because it's right. They think it because they observe it. You know, I mean, there's just no contradicting it.
Well, I am certain that whenever this comes out, it is not going to change your mind at all. But maybe you'll find it interesting just to hear what they have to say. So I really appreciate you taking some time aside. I know you're super busy right now, have a bunch of people in camp. So I know you kind of went on your way to do this with me, and I really appreciate it.
No problem, man. Good luck with it.
All right. Thanks a lot, Mark. All right. Finally, we've got Lindsay Thomas Jr. coming on with us. And Lindsay is the editor of the Quality Whitetails magazine. He's the communications director for QDMA, and he's also got some other experience in the outdoor industry. And I wanted to bring him on because he is basically one of the main reasons that we're having this discussion in the first place. Lindsay came on Mark Kenyon's Rut Radio podcast a few times talking to Spencer Newharth, who we talked to earlier. And he was talking about basically the weather didn't matter as far as what the movement was going to be for next week. And I think we covered this with Spencer already. So first of all, welcome to the show, Lindsay.
Thanks, Mike. Appreciate you having me back.
I just got off the phone with Mark Drury, and Mark shares the opinion of, I don't know what the percentages are, but I would say 95 to 98% of hunters believe that the weather specifically, affects deer movement, and, cold weather is better. And I'm kind of glad I can talk to you because here's my thing. Before I talked to Mark, I was really starting to lean towards all these GPS studies. I really like following the science and believe in the GPS stuff, and I'm really into that. But I tell you what, talking to Mark, he is so passionate and brings so much experience to the table, it's hard for me to discount that too. And I'll say this about Mark. He had no idea who else I'm talking to. He hasn't read these studies. He's only bringing his personal experience to the table. So, I'm not expecting you to speak specifically anything to what Mark said. I'm just looking for your experience with what these studies have said. So maybe to just kind of give me a quick summary of what you believe as far as deer movement, as far as temperature and weather goes, and how you came to that belief.
Well, I think you can, right off the bat, put me in with the 95 to 98% that Mark said believe weather impacts deer movements. As a hunter, yeah, it's something I've, believed for a long time, or was raised believing that, taught that by other hunters. You hear passionate people say this is how it works. And certainly as a hunter, you witness things that seem to reinforce that. So as a deer hunter, do I get excited when a weekend is going to coincide in November with a, lovely fall cold front, and things are going to be, cool and still and clear on a Saturday morning in November? Heck yeah. I get very excited as a deer hunter because I have that instinct that so many of us have, that's when movement's going to be good and I'm going to have good opportunities there. So my belief is, as a hunter, I'm going to play that card. I'm going to try to take advantage of that pattern. But as a journalist who researches all of the science and keeps up with the scientists out there and looks at the studies and what they've learned, it's clear that the science says there's little to no impact, or at least at this point, we don't yet understand how weather factors work to affect deer movements. There's no evidence yet, a lot of evidence against the idea that weather changes some predominant patterns in deer movement that are well established. And what I'm talking about is deer move most at dawn and dusk. Any given day of the year, bucks, does, all of them most of the movement is going to be at dawn and dusk. Those will be the 2 daily peaks. That doesn't mean they don't move at other times. They move during the night and somewhat during the middle of the day, but still those other time periods will be lower than deer movement rates at dawn and dusk. And a lot of factors have been looked at to see whether they impacted that. And there's been some slight effect seen, but nothing significant enough to make a valid statement that we can predict that weather or the moon phase or other factors change that general pattern in deer movement.
Okay, so you said, like, as a hunter, you feel better about, cold weather. And I know some of that has to do with, of course, we want to be outside when it's more comfortable to be out there. It's not fun to be, hanging a tree stand or something when it's 85 degrees out. But the science says that, well, it doesn't really matter. Just be out there any day and your chances are going to be equal. When you blend those two things, how sure do you feel like when you're going hunting, it doesn't really matter what the temperature is?
I guess the way I think about it is, like you just said, blending those two things. I think that the mistake we often make as hunters when we're trying to interpret any of this stuff or make definitive conclusions about deer behavior on our own, is that, we let internal, maybe unconscious biases lead us to jump to certain conclusions, and we forget to rule out other factors. If we're seeing a lot of deer in a certain location at a certain time, we might jump to say, oh, it was because the weather was a certain way that day is why I saw deer. But we forgot to stop and go, wait a minute, could it have been hunting pressure in another location that affected why I saw deer there? Could it have been food? Could it have been the location of an estrus doe as to why I saw a buck when I saw a buck? And that's what science does, is it rules out all those other factors. So I think that, again, as a hunter, I want to be out there on that cold, post-frontal, clear, November day or October, whatever day of the year it is, even, later after the rut. You want to be when you think the weather is conducive to deer movement, but I'm never forgetful of those other things. In other words, I'm not going to charge out there saying the weather's great, but forget to consider my own hunting pressure or the pressure of other hunters, or forget to consider what the food condition is out there and where the food is, or cover, or other factors that are going to determine the best place to be that day to see deer. So I guess that's what it comes down to for me, knowing that the science says that weather isn't everything. And that the science also says a lot of other factors are involved, like pressure and food and the stage of the rut. I'm going to consider those things too, all together, and try to make it all fit together into this puzzle piece that helps me look at 10 different stand options and pick the right one. And somehow, why is it I always fail?
Maybe because you're not only going on cold days when the moon is in this phase and when
they've still gotten me beat somehow. I don't know if this ever gets easy. I guess it won't be fun anymore.
I think that's true. Okay, so is there like a point that you can think back to when you're maybe first realized that maybe the temperature doesn't matter? I can think when I first started hunting, I wasn't, as much as it seems like common sense to, it's the deer move better when it's cold. I can think back when I first started hunting, I had no clue. And I had going on places where, I'd go once or twice a year with family that really, had not looked into this stuff. And we just kind of went when we went. And, when I look back years later, I was like, well, yeah, maybe the days we saw less deer, the weather wasn't good. But that might be confirmation bias as well. Like, well, maybe that was because we'd already hunted the whole day prior, or that type of thing. Is there like a time you look back and maybe a study came out or something that you can think of that you were like first started to think, you know what, maybe there's something to these studies?
I think the first time for me, going back, I've been at QDMA for almost 15 years. Before that, I worked for Georgia Outdoor News Magazine, which is the #1 hunting and fishing magazine here in Georgia. And I was one of the editors there. And at the time, I was in charge of GON's truck buck contest. Anybody in Georgia who reads GONs, or even those who don't, have probably heard about truck buck contest, which is you have to be a GON subscriber, and then you're entered. And if you kill a buck and send him in, it's the big deer contest. There's the best deer of each week of the season wins that week, and then they have a shootout for a truck. So it's the truck buck contest. Well, I was in charge of that and dealt with getting in all of the entries each week. And we're talking about, hundreds of deer entered over the course of a season in this contest each year, and always usually the best deer. There was rarely that one of the, big deer killed in a season wasn't by a GON subscriber, because many people, you hedged your bets. You subscribed to make sure you were eligible for the contest. Well, I adjusted the entry form one year to try to collect some data that I wanted to see about when and where and why these bucks were killed, the best bucks each year in Georgia. And so I added some check boxes on there and things like that. Like, please tell me, what other rut sign did you see when you killed this buck? What time of the day was it? What was the weather like? Was it, give me the air temperature. Was it windy or not windy? Was it raining or not raining? Things like that. And at the end of the season, again, I'm looking at hundreds of good bucks killed all over the state. And the first year I did this, started compiling all these numbers and started looking for patterns. Did I see any pattern among when all these good bucks were killed that seemed to stand out? And across weather, across time of the day, and everything else, do you know what the one factor that stood out as being a predictable factor in when these deer were killed? Do you know what it was?
I do, only because you told me, so I'm not going to steal your thunder. Because I didn't know until you said it. So you tell me this time.
I forgot I told you this already, but it was whether it was Saturday or not. That was when most of these big bucks were killed, was Saturday, when most everybody can go hunting. You don't have to work. You can be in the woods. That's when you go. That's when most of these deer were killed. Certainly some were killed during the week, but looking at air temperature, looking at whether it was raining or not, whether it was high winds, medium winds, low winds, moon phase, there was no pattern to any of those things, not time of day even. Really, it was whether it was the weekend. That was the biggest or the really only predictable factor. And that was one of the things that first started making me think about, maybe it's less about some of these other things we think of, moon and weather, and more about just getting in the woods and going when you can. I still think that's not everything. You still have to think about pressure. You still have to think about food, the stage of the rut, cover, and all these other aspects. But in the end, I go hunting when I can go hunting.
So if it's not weather and those things, what do you think the number one influencer on movement is?
Well, it changes. In a buck's annual cycle, it changes what's motivating him to move. We know, for example, from most of these studies, GPS studies and others, that if you look at buck movement as a daily movement rate in meters or yards or miles or however it's measured in a particular study, that daily movement rate is increasing daily and weekly as the rut approaches and peaks when the breeding peaks. Then it begins to decline again. And then at other times of year, it's about food and cover. So it changes. Again, that's why you have to think about what time of year are you hunting? What's going to be on a buck's mind then? Is it early season when they're not really, the testosterone isn't going yet and they're thinking about food still? Are they still on a summer food pattern? Or is it during the rut and they're looking for does? Because the other problem is, we got bucks use the greatest percentage of their home range at any time of year in the rut. So they're moving around a lot. And that's, the other interesting thing about that is there's no evidence in those movement rates I'm talking about of anything like a lockdown phase. Another thing that hunters are convinced of. Many hunters are convinced that there's a lockdown phase of the rut where bucks go to ground and you don't see them. There's no evidence of that in these GPS collared deer. But the fact that, you have to look at it in other ways. The fact that these bucks are covering huge percentages of their home ranges this time of year, 100% of it. Could that explain why you're not seeing a buck today or for 2 days in a row? Maybe he's in another part of his home range and just hadn't been around where you'd been seeing him. So, we have to always stop and think about the other explanations.
I know you were just at that Southeast Deer Study Group, and one of the topics that came up was deer movement when the hurricane went through this past summer. And I know they looked at how that affected deer movement, and I was interested to hear, what the case was there.
Yeah, I was excited to see this on the agenda too, Mike, because, talking about weather and how it affects deer movement, it seemed like the perfect test case. The University of Georgia and Virginia Tech, this presentation was given by Heather Abernathy Connors, who did the study. She's at Virginia Tech now. But UGA and the Florida Fish and Wildlife Conservation Commission were involved too. They were tracking almost 80 deer, whitetails, with GPS collars in Southwest Florida. This is in the range of the Florida panther. And there's a huge study going on down there looking at panthers and deer interactions and deer survival in this, mixed type Everglades area. Well, all these deer were out there wearing GPS collars when Hurricane Irma nearly dead centered the study area last September 2017. 12 inches of rain in a day, 135 mile per hour sustained winds in this area. And I was curious, like I figure a lot of hunters would be, wow, all these deer out there wearing GPS collars, what'd they do? I've often thought when we think about weather and how it affects deer, one of the themes we talk about is barometric pressure. Does barometric pressure act as the cue for deer, that somehow becomes the warning that, alert, there's a front coming through. The pressure often swings, or drops ahead of a front. Could that be the tip-off? And so a lot of people believe, well, it's barometric pressure. We'll talk about a shift in pressure with a hurricane coming through. You don't ever see a shift in pressure like you do when a hurricane is about to hit you. And sure enough, when Irma went through there, the barometric pressure dropped in a big, big way. So what did they see? Did they see these deer anticipate this rough weather coming? Did they, start moving ahead of time? Answer was no. They did not see deer increase their movement in the days leading up to the hurricane's hit. What little movement they saw, and it was among does increased their movement a little bit that day, but it was as the hurricane was hitting. It was when all this wind and rain was falling, they were moving to a little bit higher ground, what there is of high ground in Southwest Florida, to areas that were less prone to flooding, simply to kind of get away from rising waters. But again, the hurricane had already hit. The barometric pressure swung, over the 24 hours leading up to that. So if that was a factor, these deer ignored it. Bucks did not change their movements except for the fact that over the bigger period of about 2 weeks surrounding the hurricane, they were gradually decreasing their daily movements each day because for them it was post-rut. In that area of Florida, as you know, in September, that's post-rut. These deer are breeding in July and even in August. So these bucks, as expected, as have been seen in many other studies, were decreasing their daily movement rates, and that didn't change as the hurricane went by. They continued to just kind of move less and less. So they did not see them make any dramatic changes in movement when the hurricane came through either. So at least in Southwest Florida, that kind of kicked out the idea that barometric pressure is somehow a tip-off to deer that rough weather's coming and they need to move ahead or after it's all over.
Well, I think that's interesting. It's not like the type of thing that's going to, be the end-all, be-all of this type of thing, but it's just another piece of the puzzle that you try to put together of, an extreme circumstance maybe might change it. So I think it's interesting to share that.
Yeah, I think it's a very cool study. Like we talked about, scientific studies are like sighting your gun in. So this is another bullet on paper that added in with the other studies begins to show us some patterns.
Yeah. So I know this is not the type of topic that the QDMA would take some type of, official stance on or try to promote one way or the other. But I am interested in maybe a general feeling around QDMA, just because I know you have a lot of wildlife biologists working for you. Obviously, a lot of people who are really into deer and deer hunting, but there's also a lot of focus on science within the organization. So is this something where you're the rogue guy and you have this kind of thing, or is there a lot of people that feel the same way? What's, you guys have discussions on this type of stuff?
Yeah, we do. And I think most everybody here, I'm not a wildlife biologist, but I've talked with the other guys here, Kip Adams and Brian Murphy and others, Joe Hamilton, who are wildlife biologists. Matt Ross, who did some digging into, has written on some of this on our website about buck movement patterns. And at the same time, too, like I was at the Deer Study Group meeting here recently, as we talked about, and being there with many of the other, many leading deer researchers in the nation all in one place. This is a topic recently that I asked some of them about. And pretty much, I think you could take all these people, QDMA's wildlife biologists that are on staff, myself, and a lot of these other experts I've talked to, and kind of group them in the same opinion, and that is the science seems to be clear that so far we can't really pin down or quantify the exact way that weather factors come together to impact deer movement, but as hunters, we feel strongly that it does somehow. And so, again, on a nice cold Saturday in November, where are we going to be? We're going to be in a deer stand. Many of us, of course, hunt when it's not great conditions too. Like I said, we often, I like to go any chance I can. Hot weather in bow season early, to cold weather late after the rut's over. So I think that's what it comes down to. We all, feel that the pattern in the science, there are too many studies. It's not just one study, too many studies stacked together that don't really show weather breaking apart those predictable patterns that we already know about. And yet, as hunters, we feel that maybe it's something we don't fully understand yet. Maybe it's something that the right study hasn't truly addressed. Because, think about this. Many times, these researchers are looking at other things. Maybe they're studying highway mortality among deer, or they're studying, coyote predation, or other factors in deer survival and all kinds of things, and they happen to have GPS collars on them. Well, they end up with these big data sets of movement, and often as a second thought, they think, hey, what happens if we plug in some weather data to this and see what happens? But there really hasn't been anyone who's gone out there and said from the start, we're going to tackle this idea that weather affects deer movement, and we're going to find out for sure, what the deal is. Because, as I was talking to Bronson Strickland at Deer Study Group, and the way Bronson put it to me, and Bronson's one of those who, and you may have asked him about this, but Bronson's one of those who says the science is clear, weather doesn't have an impact, but as a hunter, I'm going to hunt a cold front. And what Bronson said about this was, maybe deer are moving when, the weather's hot, or times when we think they shouldn't be moving because of what we believe. But they're just moving in different ways, or moving in different areas, or sticking tighter to cover, or not in the places we think, they should be, or for whatever reason. Again, we haven't really just drilled into this and figured out the combination of factors. Because again, I really believe it's going to end up being more complicated than just air temperature. If the air temperature drops below a certain point, deer are going to move. It's going to be more complicated than that, whatever we figure out. There's all kinds of other things that will come into play. So maybe that's it. Maybe we just don't have the right study or studies yet that have tackled this thing head on and tried to figure it out once and for all.
Yeah, and I'll say for me, a lot of times it's not going to make so much a difference whether I go hunting or not, because I've got a limited number of days that I'm going to be able to go hunting, and I'm not going to skip hunting one of those limited days because it's hot. But it could make a difference. I'm in the stand and it's 10 o'clock and it's starting to get hot. Oh, well, the deer aren't going to move today because it's not a cold front going through versus, trying to sit all day, that type of thing. So, while it doesn't impact me personally for the number of days in the field, it could make a big difference in how I hunt and where I hunt. I'm going to pick the best stands on the days I think are the best days to be in there.
Right.
Well, thanks so much for this, Lindsay. I think this conversation we just had, it was a good way to wrap this up. I don't think we necessarily solved anything, but maybe we could have furthered the debate on it a little bit. And I'm certainly interested to re-listen to what everybody's got to say and just try to help formulate my own feelings on the subject. I can tell you this, I'm not sure that I cleared anything up for sure.
Yeah, it's pretty complicated. Like I said, this is not, a simple yes or no question. There's layers to it.
I think the science is really compelling, but so is the groupthink or the overwhelming majority feeling the same way. It's like, well, you don't want to believe the wrong way. It's, you don't want to be the last guy thinking the earth is flat. But if you have data, you've sailed around the world and you know the Earth is round, you don't want to be still saying the Earth is flat just because everybody else does.
Well, the bottom line is, well, in a case like this, even somebody like me who strongly believes in the science because, and I wanted to, we could talk forever about this, but with hunters, we're dealing with anecdotal data many times, just a snapshot of some observation we had. Science is much more comprehensive, and it has rules about measuring other factors and ruling things out and making sure everything is, statistically significant and all of that. We don't play by those rules like science does. So I feel very good about science, particularly when many studies stack up and start showing a pattern. But that still doesn't mean for me as a hunter that it's gospel. And, I think that's where, you can be wrong, is to believe the extreme all the time, to believe either that science is BS and I'm a hunter and I know better and I can just tell you 100% what deer are going to do, or to believe the opposite, which is hunters don't know crap and it's the science and hunters are completely wrong. I don't subscribe to either one of those viewpoints. So like I said, I don't think we've figured it all out yet.
Well, thank you so much, Lindsay. All right, that's going to be a wrap for part 2. Thank you so much for listening. And just a couple things before I let you go. If this is something you're enjoying, I would really, really appreciate it if you would be willing to share this with your friends, share it on social media, and reach out to us, let us know. But the biggest thing is if you share this and we can get some more downloads, it really makes a huge impact to us. We're a small enough podcast where every download counts to us, and we know that there's somebody out there listening. So we really appreciate that. And if you would go ahead and share it, it would mean a ton to me. So last thing, part 3 is going to be coming out next week. I got one more interview to do before we can wrap that all up, and we're going to hear our thoughts. I'm going to share what I think based on all of this, and I hope you've enjoyed this. I really enjoyed it. I think this is something that I'm personally going to want to go back and listen to a few times over. This is something that's been on my mind for the last 6 months after doing these interviews, and I'm really looking forward to actually getting out hunting and taking what I've heard and seen and putting it into practice based on actual field experience for myself. So I hope you come back and listen to part 3, hear our thoughts and opinions, and I hope you're enjoying the podcast. We're out down south.